Well, good morning, everybody. So the purpose of my presentation this morning is to provide an update on economic conditions in the region since we last met at the last press briefing, which was in May. So I'm going to focus my remarks this morning on three broad categories. So first, I'll talk a little bit about overall economic activity in the region. I'll have some things to say about employment, and then I'll conclude with some remarks on housing and household finances. And what I'll show you is that during the second quarter of 2011, activity expanded in New York State and in New York City. It held steady in New Jersey and declined slightly in Puerto Rico. In terms of employment, what I'll show you is that job growth generally was stronger here in the region than it was in the nation, although in both cases it remained weak, and as a result, unemployment rates continued to edge up. In terms of housing and household finances, while housing markets remain weak, it does appear that there's been some firming in the regional housing markets. Nonetheless, there are clearly pockets of financial stress that remain. So let me get started and talk a little bit about regional economic activity. Okay, and so what I'm showing you here are what we use to measure economic activity. These are coincident economic indicators, or what we call CEIs, for New York City and New York State. And these are just summary measures that capture movements in the regional business cycle. And what you can see clearly here is that during the downturn, these indexes were declining, indicating that regional activity was contracting, through about the end of 2009, when these indexes turned up, which is a signal that activity began to expand again as the recovery took hold. At the time of our last briefing, when we had data through March, it looked as though in New York State and in New York City, activity was expanding. What's been the case since then? Okay, well, these patterns have actually continued pretty much on pace with what we've seen in the past. And for both New York City and New York State, the quarterly growth rate was just a bit under 1%. How do things look for New Jersey? Well, New Jersey has a slightly different picture. As we've shown before, the recovery in New Jersey has been sluggish, and at the time of our last briefing, you can see that activity was holding firm. That pattern has more or less continued since then. Although if you look carefully at the monthly readings of our CEI for New Jersey, you can see that there's been an ever so slight but steady increase in the index, which is starting to suggest that there is a firming in activity and possibly even somewhat of a turnaround occurring there. So that's something that we'll be keeping an eye on. In terms of Puerto Rico, we use a similar index to monitor conditions in Puerto Rico that's constructed by the Government Development Bank. And you can see that Puerto Rico, which has been in decline for much longer than the mainland, was having some fits and starts at the last time that we met. That sort of zigzag activity has continued, and there's been a very slight decline in activity in Puerto Rico. One thing that's really important to keep in mind here for Puerto Rico, though, is that we do not yet have data from the very positive June report incorporated into this index, and so it's important to keep that in mind. So now turning to jobs, what I'm showing you here is an index of overall total employment for the U.S., and you can see clearly that during the downturn there was a sharp decline in jobs. Jobs were lost through into 2010 when the slow recovery began. Okay, and that slow recovery continued in the second quarter with job growth for quarter 2 2011 at 0.2%. How do things look for the region? Okay, well, you can see that the region fared a little different. You can see that New Jersey was much closer to the U.S. than New York, which had far less job loss. And focusing on just the most recent quarter, you can see that both New Jersey and New York experienced job growth that was a bit above what was going on in the U.S. So it's important to keep in mind that while that's positive, these are all weak numbers. Okay, in terms of some of the sectors in New York State and New Jersey that were strong in the second quarter, professional and business development remains strong, education and health remain strong, and the trade areas remain strong. And that's been the case for the past several quarters. Of course, Erica is going to talk in much more depth later on in the briefing about some of the changes that are occurring at the sectoral level. However, for those who are interested, in the appendix of the materials you have today, there are job growth by sector charts by region if you want to take a closer look at what's happening closer to your area. Okay, New York City, which has been quite resilient during the downturn and the recovery, most recently actually had a bit of a job loss. But what I'll show in a minute is that that's largely driven by activity and job loss in the public sector. In Puerto Rico, where again job loss has been much more severe than on the mainland. You can see clearly with this index that starting in around 2010, mid-2010, that pace of job loss at least moderated, and actually in the most recent quarter, there's been some significant uptick in job growth on the island. But again, what I'll show you when you peel it away is that that's largely driven by actually some expansion in the public sector. If you were to look across all the different areas in the region and sort of sum it up, on balance over the second quarter, our region expanded jobs by about 50,000 jobs. Okay, so what is explaining some of this sluggish growth that we've been seeing nationally and here in the region? Okay, well, a significant contributor to this is the weakness of the public sector. So what I'm showing you here is job growth for the last quarter, quarter 2, 2011, split apart private sector and public sector growth. And what you can see here is that while the private sector continued to expand, the public sector across the board was continuing to provide a drag on job growth. And that was particularly the case in our region. We've continued to shed jobs at a more rapid clip than nationally. And in the last quarter, that was especially true in New York City. Now in Puerto Rico, as I mentioned before, you can see that the pattern's exactly opposite. In Puerto Rico, you can see that the private sector continues to remain weak and that a significant or a key contributor to the recent job growth in Puerto Rico has been some expansion in the public sector. Now it's important to keep in mind that for several years leading up to this, Puerto Rico's been shedding jobs at a rapid clip in the public sector, and so this recent growth is coming off of a very low base. Okay, how do things look around the region? So this is a map of the metropolitan areas in the 2nd District. Any area shaded in blue represents job growth. Any metropolitan area shaded in red indicates job loss. The dark blue areas, which are mostly concentrated in upstate New York and in the lower Hudson Valley, show places where job growth was above the U.S. And it's no surprise that this is tended to be in the more stable parts of the district in upstate New York and lower Hudson Valley, where the education sector, which is a growing sector, is strong. In terms of the areas where there's been some recent job loss, if you look across, there's really no single pattern that describes what's going on. This tends to be more broad-based weakness, although the one thing that does stand out is that state and local job loss in these areas does tend to be a bit above average. Okay, what does this mean for unemployment rates? Well, you can see that I'm plotting out here unemployment rates for New York State, New Jersey, New York City relative to the United States. You can see that in all cases there was an uptick in the unemployment rate through the recession with a very modest decline. And more recently, there's been, again, an uptick in unemployment rates, again, mostly because of the sluggish job growth. And where things stand now at the end of at quarter 2, 2011, New Jersey and New York City are more or less on par with the nation. New York State is significantly below, which is again reflecting the fact that upstate New York tends to have lower unemployment rates generally. The exception to the rule here has been Puerto Rico, which in general has a much higher unemployment rate than the mainland. And more recently, you can see, again, because of some of the recent job growth on the island, a fairly substantial decline in the unemployment rate. But it's important to keep in mind that across the board in the region, these unemployment rates remain exceptionally high. Okay, now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little about the region's housing markets. And it's important to keep in mind that there's a strong connection between housing and local economic performance, and that has definitely been the case in the most current cycle. So what I'm showing you here is the decline in home prices at the national level from the peak. And from the peak in March 2006 through the beginning of 2009, home prices declined nationally by about 30%. And around that time is when the home buyer tax credit went into effect, and you can see that there was some stabilization and firming in home prices with the home buyer tax credit. That lasted until it expired at the end of June 2010, at which time home prices continued to decline nationally at a more modest pace. One of the major reasons why home prices continue to decline nationally is the impact of distressed sales, sales that are from bank-owned properties or short sales. And they've continued, as housing markets have adjusted, to exert a downward pressure on prices. Okay, well, as many of you know, in our region, in the U.S. in the second quarter, the prices fell by a little over 1%. So in the region, we've had less of the effects of the housing boom and bust. And you can see here for New York State and for New York City that during the downturn, prices did not decline as much. There was some firming during the homebuyer tax credit period. And importantly, starting at the beginning of 2011 in both New York State and New York City Metro, home prices actually started to firm. And one of the key reasons here that you're seeing a difference is that we have fewer of these distressed sales that are in our markets. Picture for New Jersey looks similar. You can see that New Jersey was a little bit more hard hit than, I think the answer is no. You can see that in New Jersey, a little bit more hard hit than in New York. But again, recently there's been a bit of an uptick in home prices in New Jersey, which started in March of 2011. And so this recent firming in home prices in the region is an encouraging sign. It's only been happening now for a few months, and so it's something we're going to be paying attention to as we monitor conditions. Okay, just to wrap things up, I want to focus on household finances. So what I'm showing you here is the share of total debt outstanding that is seriously delinquent, defined as 90 plus days delinquent. This is a measure of household financial stress. And I'm taking this measure from the quarterly report on household debt and credit that the New York Fed publishes on a quarterly basis. This is incorporating information for quarter 2 of 2011, and the full report, for those who are interested, will be released on Monday. This is for the U.S., and you can see that during the downturn in financial crisis, delinquency rates increased sharply, indicating that financial stress also increased. But since about 2010, have been moderating, indicating that households on balance are starting to repair their household finances. Within the region, you see a very similar pattern. In New York State, delinquency rates increased sharply and then fell, again indicating that within New York State, household balance sheets are beginning to be repaired. In New Jersey, you see a very similar rise with a little bit earlier leveling off, but one slight difference in what's going on in New Jersey is that the trend is a little bit upward, suggesting that financial stress continues to be accelerating a bit there. Okay, in Puerto Rico, where again the recession was in effect for a much longer time, you can see that even before the downturn on the mainland, the delinquency rates were higher. That's continued to be true, and it's only very recently where we started to see any kind of leveling off in the delinquency rate. Nonetheless, even though there's been some firming or declining in the delinquency rate, these rates remain elevated, indicating that financial stress exists in the region. But even this is hiding the pockets of financial stress that exist within the region. So what I want to leave you with is a map of the 2nd District. And this is a county-based map that shows delinquency rates as of the 2nd quarter. Anything in blue is indicating places where delinquency rates are below the national rate. Anything in red is indicating where delinquency rates are above the national rate, with the bright orange or bright red signaling substantially above the U.S. rate, above 10%. And what you can see here is that there's real pockets of financial stress concentrated in and around New York City, with the one exception being Manhattan, where they're a little bit below the U.S. rate. Okay, just to wrap things up here, in terms of a summary, I guess in terms of the big picture, the recovery continued at a slow pace during the 2nd quarter of 2011 in our region. Economic activity expanded or held steady. Employment growth, while sluggish, generally outpaced the nation, although it's important to keep in mind that the public sector remains weak, and that's something we're going to be paying attention to, and unemployment rates remain high. Regional housing markets appear to be firming, but remain fragile. And lastly, pockets of household financial stress clearly remain in the region, with especially high delinquency rates in and around New York City. So, of course, we're going to continue to monitor the economic performance of the region. Thank you very much for your attention, and at this point, I'm going to turn the podium over to Erica Groshen to talk a little bit about job creation in the region.